Okay.
Hello, I'm Rob Millen, and we're pleased to be back in conversation with Michelle Smith. Michelle is well known on Southern Vancouver Island as a certified trauma practitioner. Michelle has 24 years experience helping people with grief recovery and survivors of traumatic death of a loved one. Besides her private practice and being a mom, a working mom in fact, Michelle is the founder and president of Erin's Society Focus on Trauma, a nonprofit organization that offers peer education, support, and workshop for trauma sufferers. Welcome, Michelle. How are you today?
I'm fine. Nice to see you again, Rob.
Michelle, we've had a lot of feedback on our interview on the COVID-19 lockdown and collective trauma. People have asked to learn more. But before we begin, we should start with a quick recap of what trauma is and also collective trauma. And I wonder if I may take the liberty of doing that.
Absolutely.
Okay, I took notes from our last interview, so let's see how I do. So trauma. Trauma can result from an event or a series of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically and emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has adverse effects on the individual's physical, emotional, social, or spiritual well-being. It is generally a life experience that involves actual or perceived threats to one's safety or the safety of a loved one, usually categorized by feelings of helplessness and terror with the individual, unable to make sense or to come to terms with the event. The circumstances commonly include abuse of power, betrayal of trust, entrapment, pain, confusion, helplessness, and or loss.
Good
How'd
job.
I do?
Good
How'd I do?
job. Very good. Very good. You were listening.
All right, well, let me take a crack at defining a collective trauma. Collective trauma is often described as, quote, a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of communality. It is often less recognized or visible to mental health workers in comparison to individual trauma. People find it difficult to heal from the effects of individual trauma when a supportive community is in shreds or does not exist. This is why establishing links between individuals and groups is essential.
Awesome job.
I got it?
You got it.
Good. Well, now it's time to hear, Michelle, from you. So, Michelle, can we take a look at the COVID-19 lockdown measures that have been imposed individually and their relationship to trauma? For example, could you start with, say, social isolation?
Yeah, the social isolation, given the description of collective trauma that you just gave, can directly or indirectly, it can cause the cementing in of fear, loneliness, poor health. It's associated with an increase in cognitive decline, depression, anxiety, a decrease in memory function. It can lead to obsessive thinking. In some people, psychotic symptoms can arise due to deprived sensory experience and an increased risk of substance abuse and high suicide incidents. So social isolation has been actually associated with a 29% increase in mortality. But of particular note is that it has been associated with an increase in the sympathetic nervous system. I'm actually going to bring a diagram up here, Rob, of that so that people actually know, what I'm talking about. Let me see if I can get this working.
Yes, we have it on the screen.
Yeah, that's not the right one. No. I'm actually, okay, this is actually the one I'm looking for. Can you see that okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. you have to forgive, I'm not exactly a technical brain surgeon here. So this is a threefold, sort of broken down as a threefold picture of the brain, with the neocortex, which is the rational thinking part of the brain. And then you have the midbrain, which is the limbic or emotional or feeling part of the brain. And then you have the brain stem, reptilian brain, some people call it primitive brain, other people call it. Well, if you get information, it'll come in through the reptilian part of the brain, and it's just information. It's not usually analyzed, or it's just kind of raw information. And then that gets passed on to the emotional part of the brain. This little green area that you see here in the emotional part of the brain, is the tissue that you see here, is actually called the amygdala. And the amygdala is what we call our fire alarm or a danger center. And I'm going to just take you back. It's our danger center. And when we are perceived danger or something something is going to happen, this is what kind of screams danger, danger, danger. And so it kind of ignites everything else. So it happens in the amygdala. And then this is actually the nervous system. You have the parasympathetic nervous system and you have the sympathetic nervous system. And what happens when we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system with trauma is, once a danger signal is gone, the body starts to flood, usually, but not always, the sympathetic nervous system. And you can see this is all connected to your major organs. You know, the heart rate accelerate, gets us ready for fight or flight. So we have the sympathetic nervous system is igniting. We have it's like it's got an on switch, and on it switches getting us ready for fight or flight. And if that threat does not disappear, we have a switched on sympathetic nervous system that has not switched off. Generally, if the threat disappears, the parasympathetic takes over and everything calms down. The parasympathetic is also responsible for a freeze response. But the fight or flight is right there in the sympathetic nervous system. And so you get your body with cortisol and adrenaline, and you're in fight or flight, and you've got a fear reaction. And again, with things like when they're saying, well, you know, the nervous system isn't shut off. And with COVID, of course, you're talking, did our screen not work out right? Oh, there we go.
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Okay. So when we're talking about affecting an increase in sympathetic nervous system activity, that's precisely what trauma does. Is it switches on that nervous system, and it doesn't shut off like it normally would. So it's interesting that social isolation will actually affect the sympathetic nervous system activity. So hopefully that explains that process a little bit. Trauma response also causes hypervigilance. And, you know, that is also a trauma symptom. You'll find fear, isolation, memory impairment, cognitive decline, or trouble making decisions, anxiety, and all the others mentioned under possible symptoms of trauma.
Did you have a graph on that that you can share with us?
Yes, and you know, I'm going to wait until we finish what you're wanting me to go through, and then I'm going to show you that list of symptoms. So you've heard, you know, that social isolation can cause all of these things, but social isolation has also been used historically by cults and the occult, or any other individual or organization that seeks to completely control their victim. They will traditionally cut them off from family, friends, social interaction, etc. So from a trauma practitioner's perspective, it's precisely the opposite to what we see as healing for the individual. So bringing community and supportive groups and so on around the individual. Now, if you're just staying at home for a couple of weeks because you're not feeling well, you're probably, it isn't going to have as devastating effects, although there are some people that actually felt has suffered effects in as little as 2 weeks. But when you couple this with social distancing and mask wearing and constant negative media reports and economic lockdown or shutdown and lack of community contact and support groups such as church or other organizations, it's not a wonder we're seeing rates of mental health issues and PTSD are being reported at all.
Let's delve into that a little bit further. What are your thoughts on social distance and mandatory masks?
Well, human beings we're social creatures. We have an inherent universal need for belonging and for independence. So social distancing, even if it's occasionally you'll hear from people, I don't like people anyway, but regardless of that, we still have that inherent universal need for belonging. So social distancing can create many of the same things as social isolation does, as well as driving a public with nonstop fear and making everyone the enemy. And so once you're social distancing from people, everyone becomes the enemy, and this is a constant driving of that fear factor. This in turn is affecting relationships, even some really close ones actually. Fear, fear is the basis of trauma. So social distancing seems to be affecting our young people in particular with high-risk behavior and in very negative ways for some. We're seeing more with not only high-risk behavior, which is a symptom of trauma, but as well we're seeing increased reports of self-harm in our young people and so on. So mental health professionals are warning of the effects of social distancing and isolation and waiting for things to calm before providing adequate help could prove disastrous. So it's also a consideration that this may carry on for some time after this threat is gone and take significant time to come to terms with for many people. So we're not going to see the end of this just simply because things have settled down in terms of the COVID itself. So when it comes to the elderly in care homes, the ones we believe we are protecting, there's definitely two sides to that story as well, which I'll be looking at in a moment. Technology to stay connected may be an avenue, but it is a far cry from in-person visits. And for some, the technology actually reinforces their isolation. Now, you were asking me about mask wearing. Mask wearing is a historical practice, actually. That's gone on in cultures almost since the beginning of time for one reason or another. Masks often were used for rites of passage rituals in many cultures, both as a means to express change and transformation from one stage to another, or to introduce fear or intimidation when worn by others. It was often used in cultures to keep a required balance of power between, like for traditional social practices, between political relationships or inherited positions within the culture, and to ensure submission. So for our purposes, though, we're going to define a mask as something that covers either all the face or a substantial portion of the face, which is what the masks that we're using for COVID cover, a substantial portion. It's not just like it's not just an eye patch or something like that. It's covering quite a significant part of the face. I have to tell you, there are fascinating theories out there about mask wearing and their effect on the mental state, which we simply don't have time for. So some of the basic and more common findings are that masks tend to change the perception of those who are viewing the wearer, a person, because the mask is a very visible reminder of what it stands for. So when you're looking at a person wearing a mask, what you're seeing is what that mask stands for, rather than an individual in particular. So in our current situation, this is a constant public reminder. This is causing for many to see others as a threat to their safety. The face is where we perceive our identity and individuality. So mask wearing can cause feelings of depersonalization. That's a dissociative behavior, which is also a trauma symptom. depersonalization is the action of divesting someone of human characteristics or individuality. When in cultures, they tended to divest the person of their humanness. Masks tend to divest a person of their individuality or identity. They can be described. It can be described as a loss of sense of self. So also that's also a possible trauma symptom with abuse victims as well, who've been subject to the don't tell, don't talk rules. You'll likely not find them wearing a mask because it equates to a muzzle. And there are also people who have asthma, respiratory conditions, who simply cannot breathe with a mask on. Others cannot abide by having their personal identity hidden, nor do they have a social desire to be part or accepted by or blend in with any, particular group. So the mask wearing, that's as I say, it's quite a fascinating subject. And if you notice when you go into town and you see people with masks, that's what you do see. You see the reason, what they stand for, what they're wearing, but you don't see an individual because that's hidden. That identity is hidden. Now, there are some theories out there that it also affects behavior, because the more people feel that they can't be identified, the more that they will indulge in at-risk behaviors. But that is a theory. So I'm just going to leave that one out there. So were you going to say something, Rob?
Well, I was going to say that in addition to the impacts on socialization or social isolation, social distancing, and mandatory mask use, what about the effects of shutting down businesses, churches, gyms, and other organizations, aside from the obvious financial effects of doing so?
Well, aside from cutting off people's connection to community, which is so relevant, their ability to join into support groups and sports groups or their spiritual communities, all of which in this climate are even more relevant to the mental and emotional health of people, we have in many cases destroyed their purpose. Trying to find relevant purpose in current circumstance is really important. And how exactly does one do that when their business, their life's work, the ability to feed their families, and perhaps the loss of homes are now becoming that's right in front of them, that's looming in front of them. So is it a wonder that we're seeing suicide rates climb and drug overdose deaths far exceeding the norm, depression, anxiety, loss of sense of self, helplessness, despair? These are all, symptoms of trauma. The two sides of the equation to take into consideration I was talking about is there are care homes, for example, where most of the people in there that are suffering, they may be suffering from dementia, and they may not really be terribly cognizant of what's going on around them, or some do have limited visitation, by appointment. But I have read or heard some very heartbreaking and disturbing stories of the other side of the coin. In one case, a woman wrote about her mother, who was in her 70s, physically disabled, but she was otherwise in full control of her mental capabilities. And according to her daughter, she made regular comments when they would visit about how blessed she was or how fortunate she was when she was visited by her grandchildren and her children. 4 months into lockdown, she was begging for assisted suicide. So we actually took her reason for living. And so several more were from nurses in care homes. And one said, my patients are dying, and not from COVID, from failure to thrive. Social activities have been shut down, and families were not allowed to visit, and it was killing her patients. So I'm actually going to show you that list of symptoms now, because I think we've mentioned enough about the various things to have a look at the symptoms of trauma. And these aren't, I need to make it really clear that these aren't all of the symptoms that you can actually have. There are more symptoms of trauma. And you don't have to have all these symptoms to be suffering from trauma. But let's just take a look at these. Loss of sense of safety. That's the ongoing thing with the COVID and the fear brings a loss of sense of safety. A loss of self, we found out with masks. A reenactment, that can be things like nightmares and revisiting the original threat. Loss of self-worth, we talked about that. Dissociation, we talked about depersonalization with masks. Loss of trust, that is happening to a very significant part of the population. Shame, sometimes loss of intimacy. Well, everything that we're doing is causing a loss of intimacy. A loss of physical connection to the body, that's a dissociative thing as well. Lots of danger cues. We talked about high-risk behavior. That's what that is. Hypervigilance. Yes, that's physical shutdown can happen. Self-harm. We talked about that. Sleep disturbance. Difficulty decision-making. We actually talked about that in terms of, I believe I called it cognitive difficulties. Memory issues, ADHD-like symptoms, easy startle response, overwhelming fear. Well, that's the very basis of what's going on here. Isolation, sexual dysfunction, emotional numbing. I am hearing a lot of that, by the way, a lot of that. It took several months, but then people started calling saying, I don't know where my emotions are gone. They've just gone. Guilt doesn't necessarily apply in this case, but can. Despair, suicide despair is the usually the crux of suicide ideation. Helplessness, of course, we can't do anything about it. We're already seeing increased drug use, suicide ideation, and hopelessness. So the bottom line is there is almost nothing on that list that that we haven't talked about in terms of it looks like I'm not getting rid of this too easy. Let's try this again. There's almost nothing on this list that hasn't applied to our. I'm not getting back on here, Rod, very easily. I don't know why.
There we are.
Yeah, there we go. So there's almost nothing on that list that we haven't talked about in terms of what the lockdown measures are actually causing together. And so those are all, and these are all trauma symptoms. Again, you don't have to have them all to be traumatized, and there are more than that. Those are some very basic symptoms, but there they all are. So how does one sort of, if they hadn't, you have to truly wonder if all outcomes were carefully considered before implementing such measures, and if they weren't, why are they not being considered now?
Well, and I think that begs the question, given the magnitude of the situation, why is appropriate trauma care so difficult to find?
Well, the study of trauma is generally known to have had somewhat of an amnesiac history. So Freud, for example, was studying it, and then it would go decades before somebody else would pick it up, and so on, pick up the ball. So the study of trauma has really only come to the foreground in the last 15 or 20 years. So that's a big part of it, of the reason. There are some very good trauma practitioners out there who have been at this actually a lot longer than I have. There's actually a couple of clinical counselors I know that were treating military personnel for this years and years ago. I know a couple of psychologists are very well versed in it, but the problem is they are not common. We simply don't have a lot of them. So we have they're not plentiful, I guess. So finding someone who's well versed in trauma and knows how to treat it. Our history is largely concentrated on talk therapy. Trauma sufferers have not found that very successful. So the lack of knowledge surrounding trauma and the overuse of the word itself, those that believe every adverse life event, of course, equates to trauma, are also struggles that we face as well. Trauma generally shows some very specific symptoms. So it's largely stuck in the body and can't be treated in that same general way. The bottoms up approach is what we are currently having a lot of success with. So.
Then is it your considered thought that those who have studied trauma care are not being utilized at every opportunity?
No, people don't distinguish when it comes to counseling. And so you have a trauma practitioner who focuses on trauma care, and that is somewhat different than a clinical counselor or a psychologist who practices or says talk counseling. Now there are some, it is getting better, and I do know some. I know a lady down in the United States who has been so well versed in this stuff for years. It's incredible. But again, most people don't know much about trauma. So when they're thinking, even as organizations, we need some help, they're thinking we need to get a counselor. And it doesn't mean that talk counseling is invalid. It is not by any stretch of the imagination. But when you're dealing with trauma, you have to deal with the fear in the system first. And so unless you know how to specifically focus on trauma and treat trauma, the chances of you actually cementing it in and re-traumatizing somebody are pretty significant.
I know we've covered some really important threads here, but can I ask you to sort of tie this all together for us in terms of the overall effect from your perspective, especially in terms of what we, or especially what you know now?
Well, and I think I'm coming from the trauma perspective. In terms of what we're seeing in terms of the lockdown measures. I'm not coming from a medical perspective at all. The public has been inundated daily by mainstream media accounts referring to this as a deadly killer virus and so on, which continues to drive the fear into the population, destroying the sense of safety for many. And one can no longer attribute media's failure to report the facts as an oversight. We simply can't. We have been told that this has a roughly 99.98% recovery rate and is more dangerous to those that have weakened immune systems or respiratory issues or other serious conditions. So why have they been allowed to continue to do this? Government and health officials have imposed massive economic, physical, mental, and emotionally damaging measures on the population. With health officials driving home the number of cases infected instead of the death toll. In the province of BC, for example, we hear all the time, well, we're up to 4,000 now. Well, why would anyone want to tell people how many people caught the flu and got well? Or didn't have symptoms at all? It's not relevant to anything. Why not just say our population is well over 5 million and there have only been 204 deaths? Isn't that a little bit more hopeful to people? This is not the bubonic plague that killed 60% of Europe and had an 80% mortality rate. But it is being presented to people like it is. And so it is continuing to drive that fear. We have the rules constantly being changing. People say, well, there's reasons for that. They get more information all the time. Well, okay, it doesn't matter what the reasons are. The rules are always changing. Don't wear a mask. Masks are mandatory. In the beginning, there was no talk of mandatory masks. During the peak months, there was no talk of mandatory masks, but as the death toll started to fall, all of a sudden, we're talking mandatory masks. Liquor stores and medical marijuana places are open. They're considered essential, and small businesses closed. Large corporate businesses open. No church going allowed, but a rally with over 7,000 people, okay. And most beaches open. No sports for kids, but school classrooms, okay. I could go on, but there's little point. I mean, we get the contradictions in what's happening. Medical information is changing and numbers being corrected quite regularly. So the CDC admitting that anyone, at one point, that anyone who has been in contact with COVID or their symptoms look reasonably like COVID are listed as a COVID death, whether or not they've been tested or not. A video of funeral directors in New York around that time, I had them stating that they were seeing cause of death as COVID put on everything, whether they were tested or whether they weren't. So testing kits contaminated, that was sent to the US, the UK, and to Tasmania, so that in Tasmania, a goat and a papaya tested positive for COVID. Why, you know, I don't care what the medical excuses are for, getting new information. This is what is happening to the public. Why is it necessary to make things look worse than they are? Why have we found that so necessary? Recent media reports are showing that 94% of deaths registered as COVID had 2 or more serious comorbid illnesses. News reports also have recently stated that in low COVID areas, testing can cause as much as a 50% false positives. And so hospitals were said to be overwhelmed, and we discovered they weren't, and hundreds in the States are actually shutting down. Media was caught using film from an Italian hospital that exaggerated the extremity of the problem and frightened people. Millions of dollars went into extra facilities that were never used. People died because of having medical procedures put on hold, and doctors were trying to diagnose people over the internet. Again, I could go on and on, but we all know what's gone on the last 6 months. We've all seen this play out. So there are this has split the population into, and there are those who are following this, that they're continuing to buy into the narrative, and those that are not buying into it. There are those that are not buying into it and do not trust their government. So we have those that have the fear of COVID and are being constantly pumped with this fear. And then we have those that have a fear of their government. They simply do not trust their government or their health officials anymore. They have no trust for them. So we're seeing trauma on both sides of this fence. I mean, not everybody's traumatized, but we're still seeing trauma on both sides of this fence. What is the government doing, and what are they going to do next, and why are they doing it, and so on and so forth. So those that are buying into the narrative will often say, well, I'm listening to the doctors. Well, let me give you some quotes from the doctors. Which doctors are we listening to exactly? There was a recent video. This is the UK's chief medical officer speaking. Surely he's qualified. He's a chief medical officer, and he says that to most people, the coronavirus is entirely harmless. Most people will never get it. Most of the people who get it won't ever experience symptoms. Most of the people who experience symptoms won't need medical care. Most of the people who need medical care won't need emergency or critical care. And even the tiny percentage of people who do need critical care, most will survive regardless of risk factors or medical history. Less than 20% of those will die, suggesting that a minute portion of the public is actually at risk of death, to be negligible in terms of this being the high risk deadly virus that they're promoting. I mean, nobody wants to see anyone die. That's absolutely true. But unfortunately, elderly and at-risk people are at risk of almost everything. We have to be careful around them. They're at risk of influenza, pneumonia, falling and breaking a hip. A cold could turn to pneumonia, bacterial infections. I mean, these are things that regularly kill our elderly and at-risk people. There are 640 doctors from around the world. There was a publicized convention by them, and they were representing thousands of doctors around the world that they were supported by from an organization they're calling Doctors for Education. They believe that the population's health is at risk by those that have used a normal flu-like virus to cause a massive panic. and economic lockdown. One doctor also, another doctor said in a nutshell that the virus is not novel. It's wrong to claim that the population would not already have some immunity. And the crowning glory of stupidity, his words, crowning glory of stupidity, is to claim that someone could have COVID without any symptoms at all and pass it on without showing any symptoms whatsoever. That would mean that the healthy sick would have to carry so much of the virus in their throats that a normal conversation between two people would be enough for the healthy one to infect the other healthy one. Who was this doctor that said that? He is the former director of the Institute of Immunology at the University of Bern, a biologist and a professor emeritus. Certainly he's worth listening to. So, and hundreds more with qualifications that can't be questioned. But for the most part, they've kind of been written off, their videos removed, and their information discredited. Why is that happening? And I'm telling you why I'm asking. It's not because I am particularly taking sides with anybody, but it seems to me that our doctors are our frontline people. So it seems to me that all doctors, no matter what field of expertise they work in, should be invited to submit their data, their observations, and their information. Many are working with patients daily on the front lines, and certainly it would seem to me that their information would be invaluable when it came to comparing data and coming to some conclusions on the best course of action. Everybody's information, I mean, there could be a lot of repetitive data where somebody's saying, oh my gosh, 850,000 doctors are finding this, there must be something in it. Instead, we're seeing a complete ignoring, or worse. It seems, if anything, that does not fit one particular narrative. Doctors and nurses, first responders, those that work with the elderly, teachers, police officers, stay-at-home moms even, that can go get groceries for someone, musicians, builders, etc. Are we going to find these people in government? Is that where we find these people? They're not in government. So then I would have to ask, well, then where do we find them? We find them in communities. That's where we find these people. Is right in communities.
Let's build on that. You shared with me an interesting analogy when we were speaking about this the other day about neighborhoods. Would you mind sharing that with us, please?
Yeah, I said, well, what if we take this whole thing and we just bring it down to a neighborhood of 12 people? So we have a neighborhood of 12 houses, and one of the homeowners has to bring his mother-in-law home because she is now to take care of, because she is now at risk. She has asthma. She's suffering from respiratory problems, and they really do need to take care of her. And, it's kind of a nasty flu year out there. So he brings her home, and he goes to all his neighbors, and he tells them, my mother-in-law is at risk, and she has asthma, and, it's a nasty flu year. So I want you to shut your businesses down. I want you to quit your jobs. I want you to isolate yourself in your houses. If you have to mow the lawn, please put a mask on. You never know what your neighbor has or what you're going to pass on. So please stay 6 feet away from any of your neighbors. Don't go near them. And keep your children home from school and isolated as well. As poverty starts setting in and houses start going up for sale because they can't afford to live anymore. And you have a real estate agent who brings around a buyer who asks, why are all these houses up for sale? And he tells them why in this neighborhood everybody's had to quit their jobs and shut down their businesses and so on because there's a lady down the street who's at risk or who has asthma. Now, when I told that story, someone said to me, well, that's absurd. And I said, really? That's what we just did. That's what we just did. So I said, if you want to take that and you want to flip that around a little bit, and you want to say that it's the same story, man brings mother-in-law home and he tells the 12 other homeowners, and they say, what can we do to help? You need somebody to bring groceries. You need somebody to help out with your business so you can be at home a little bit more. Do you need somebody to take the kids to school? Tell us whatever it is that you need, and we're there for you. One of them has to sell their houses. realtor brings a person. He sees somebody taking groceries and wants to know, why is that person taking groceries to the neighbor? And he said, well, they have a mother-in-law who's at risk, and the neighborhood is ensuring that they have everything that they need. Who's going to want to buy in that neighborhood? Everybody. The price of the house just went up, because that neighborhood is going to make everybody feel safe. Everybody has come together. Very, very basics of neighborhood. Rob, speaking after that story, would you now reread the definition of collective trauma? Now that I've said that analogy, would you reread it?
Collective trauma is often described as, quote, a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of communality, end of quote. It is often less recognized or visible to mental health workers in comparison to individual trauma. People find it difficult to heal from the effects of individual trauma when a supportive community is in shreds or does not exist. That is why establishing links between individuals and groups is essential.
There we go. So
there we go.
There we go. So, continually driving down home this fear, prolonged uncertainty and confusion, is having devastating effects on mental health. We are seeing warnings by mental health professionals absolutely everywhere, and we are seeing the effects. I'm seeing a lot of hypervigilance. I just recently found out that we have, I'm seeing excessive, actually, vigilance. Now, just so that in case that nobody knows what hypervigilance is, it is the state of being highly or abnormally alert to potential danger or to a threat. So you're always on edge and looking for that danger because it's very fear-driven. Now, a lot of demands, given that little analogy I gave you, a lot of demands that others meet someone's need for safety and be responsible and accountable for it. Here's the other thing that we are creating. We are creating an unaccountable society and an unresponsible society where we, instead of a person saying, I have family members or I am a person, what choices and decisions am I going to make for myself to ensure my well-being? Certainly there will be people that will step forward to help and to make sure, you're safe. But what are those steps that I'm going to take to ensure my well-being? What are the steps I'm going to take to ensure my children's well-being? Because one of my children, for example, may be asthmatic. But that's not what we're doing. What we're actually doing is saying, what is all the healthy people in the rest of the world going to do to ensure my well-being? That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. And it's costing all of those other people lives, livelihood, their homes, their mental health, everything. And how is it that we can actually feel that, that we're not just entitled to it, but to ignore? We can't trade lives and create more chaos and death than we save and then say, this has been a success. We simply can't do that. Other people are not responsible for our health. Other people will help, but ultimately, if you are at risk, and you and your family need to do everything that you can to minimize that risk for yourself. If somebody does not feel safe with their child going to school, there are online opportunities and so on, but you can't demand that an entire school system change to suit your child. So, but we are literally creating this unaccountable society. Now, the problem with that, it's great if we can do it, but the problem with it is accountability and responsibility is the very thing that gives us our power. It is the ability to make decisions that will change outcomes and to be able to control that and control our own lives. And that's what gives us our power. Without that, we are nothing but victims. And so giving up that ability to make decisions and control our own outcome is actually making us more vulnerable in terms of victim mentality. So we are creating that as well, which is not healthy for people. Uh, um, I'm sorry. Now, PTSD is a catch-all phrase. PTSD, I think I mentioned last time, it has to do with longevity. So from my perspective, and I think from many counselors and, many mental health professionals, the devastating effects of this is actually the pandemic. Go ahead,
Well,
Robin.
help us out here. In general, what do you see as being more helpful in limiting traumatic reaction in terms of communities?
Well, I guess I would have to, because you're asking me for perspective here, and I'm giving you my perspective, I guess I would have to ask you what you think might have happened if all that was said initially was, looks like it may be a bad flu season. Please take extra precautions with your elderly and at risk. Do you think there would have been a pandemic?
No.
Or a panic? You think there would have been panic?
Absolutely not. Why would there be?
Would we have known there was a new flu strain?
Happens every year.
Every year. Would we have been calling anything a deadly disease, a deadly pandemic? Is that what we'd be saying?
No, we'd be calling it the flu.
What we'd be doing?
It's the annual flu. There's a flu every year. Here's another one.
Exactly. So then let me bring it down to governments, because this has really been something I really have been very curious about watching happen, because it's really a precedent setter. Is it government's permission to take this situation out of our hands, out of the hands of the population and communities that will take very good care of their people, and cause monumental losses, drive millions to poverty, cause the death of an additional 10,000 children a month from hunger, destroy economics, cause trauma and mental health issues, drive up suicides and drug overdoses? Or is it the government's position to bring hope, encouragement, calm, and empowerment to its people? So I'm going to give you a quick quote from President Reagan, because even during war years, the presidents got on to bring hope and calm and encouragement to the people. That's always been the premise of government. But here's what Ronald Reagan had to say in 1976. He said, "We created government as our servant, beholding to us, and possessing no powers except those voluntarily granted to it by us. Now a self-appointed elite in our nation's capital would have us believe we are incapable of guiding our own destiny." So the last video we did, I mentioned the town of Gander. Gander is a prime example of what communities can do when left to take care of their own without interference. And they will, for the most part, do it while breathing life, love, and safety into their communities.
Well, Michelle, it sounds like you may have some personal experience with this. Can you share?
Yeah, I'd love to, actually. Many times, actually. For many years, I lived on an acreage in the country, and I had a well system and on my property that provided water for my family and property. I kept getting this bill in the mail for taxes on my well on my property. Well, I pay my property taxes. How can you send me a bill for taxes on my well that's on my property? And I thought there must be a mistake. So I called the town and I said, "I think there's been a mistake. I keep getting this water bill." And they said, "No, it's not a mistake." I said, "Well, you can't send me a water bill. I have a well on my property." And they said, "Well, yeah, you get taxed." I said, "Well, I get property taxes. Why am I getting taxed on my well water on my own property?" And they said, "Well, the money goes to help those that are to offset the cost of those who are hooked up to city water." And I said, I don't want to help offset the cost of those hooked up to city water. And he said, well, that's not very neighborly. And I said, well, when was the last time you paid your neighbor's bills? And he said, well, I don't pay my neighbor's bills. And I said, well, that's not very neighborly of you. So the flip side, the flip side of that coin was that I saw in that same community a family's house burned down, and one who lost their home because a tree, windstorm had taken it out. And I saw that community in both cases give and give and give, and donations just kept flowing in, money, all kinds of things for their home, everything. They were, really extremely well taken care of, and the community stepped forward to make sure that that family was going to be okay. Same community. So here we have the difference where the one experience takes the income of those that get up and work for it every day, and they decide where it's going to go and who will benefit from it. So that is taking from community the choice not to just give, but who they will give to. And this breeds resentments and anger and erodes the bonds in community. It is socialistic in its very premise. The other examples strengthen the bonds of community. They build strong communities and make people feel safe in their communities, and they expose some of the best in human nature by breeding empathy and loyalty and the freedom to give, and the choice and commitment and caring. So I guess I don't really think that it matters in communities much if somebody's fearful, has bought into the narrative and is wearing a mask, or if someone has not bought into the narrative and is not wearing a mask but is fearful of their own government. Perhaps if we were gracious enough to pretend we don't notice and extend our hand in love and kindness, we would be able to still the fears and calm the storm on either side of the fence and make others in our community feel safe.
Well, Michelle, just an observation, just from listening to you. Again, you don't seem to be very frightened of this whole COVID-19, shall I call it, quote, things, end of quote. Is that true? Can you share with us why?
I'm not frightened of it, and one of the reasons, well, several reasons, I guess, but I personally don't see anything out of the ordinary experience happening. We have always had flu, influenza, and cold, and other viruses. Always, it's nothing. We have always had the at-risk and the elderly. None of this is anything new for us. It isn't. I do. We should be careful of our elderly all the time. Flu strains happen all the time. Certainly government's responsibility to inform us, and also paying our taxes. If you're going to put more money back into the communities to be able to help out with anything, that's fine, but leave communities alone to do what communities do best for their own people, because this is a mess that's being caused right now. None of this, for something that is so common to us, I do hope we learn a few things. And one is that forcing healthy people to be accountable and responsible for the health of others to the point of ruination of their own lives, that's not altruistic, and it's not a virtue either. In fact, it's foolishness. You're actually trading lives. When people have the freedom to give, they give generously to those in their communities, and they do it willingly and with compassion. Everybody wins. We also have been a generation of people who put little stock in colds or flus, and so therefore have not been very careful of who we pass it on to. So this is the flip side of that coin. We think nothing of having a severe flu, needing to pick up a prescription at a pharmacy, and taking no precautions that there might be a lineup of elderly people there that can't afford to catch this. Perhaps we will be a little more willingly careful and thoughtful now. That's a silver lining with this flu season coming up. It should be interesting to see what transpires.
Well, Michelle, we're grateful that you've shared your time and expertise with us. For those of you who would like to contact Michelle, her website address is traumapractitioner.com. That's traumapractitioner.com. And you'll find a link on her website to Aaron's Society. Click on that, or you can go to the Aaron's Society website, Aaron's Society FocusOnTrauma.com. I'll repeat that, Aaron's Society FocusOnTrauma.com. Thanks for sharing, Michelle, and wishing you all the best with helping people navigate their traumatic experience and with your dedication to Aaron's Society.
I might want to mention, Rob, that Aaron's Society has two S's. Aaron is with an S and then Society. So if you're
Very
not
good.
getting on there, it's because you probably haven't put in two S's. So it's Aaron's Society, FocusOnTrauma.com. And you are so welcome, and it's always my pleasure. And it's wonderful to see you again. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Michelle.
My pleasure, Rob.